Overlord Lane, Chapter 34 Volume 5, Audio Source, WuShoWorldAudiobook.com. Overlord Volume 5 Chapter 2. Chapter 2, Blue Roses. Part 1. Lower Fire Month, 9th month, 3rd day, 8:02. Dressed in his white full-plate armor, his sword by his side, a fully equipped Climb stepped into the Valencia Palace. The Valencia Palace was roughly divided into 3 wings, and he had just entered one of them. This was the largest of the 3, where the royal family resided. Unlike Climb's dwelling place earlier, the palace was very well lit, collecting light from the outside in a brilliant display that seemed to make the interior sparkle. The polished hallways were free of litter, practically spotless, in fact. The reason why Climb's full-plate armor made no sound as he walked upon it was because it had mithril and orichalcum in its construction, and it was additionally enchanted on top of that. Along the clean and spacious hallways were the elite soldiers assigned to guard duty in the palace. They stood resplendent in their full-plate armor. They were knights. The Knights of the Empire were commoners recruited and trained into professional soldiers. In contrast, the kingdom's knights were usually third sons of landed nobles or others who could not otherwise inherit the family estate. However, the crown paid them very highly, and so only first-rate swordsmen were accepted for membership. Not even nobles could sneak in through backdoor connections. The best way to describe them would be the king's personal guard. Incidentally, Gazef's position as warrior captain was because many people opposed his knighthood, and so the king created a new appointment for him. Since then, the group of elite soldiers that he had picked and trained personally were known as warriors. Climb nodded slightly to them. Almost all of them returned the gesture. Only a few of them did so reluctantly. The vast majority were sincere in their courtesy. They might be nobles, but they were also men of martial spirit who were sworn to the king. Excellent warriors who devoted their lives to their king were worthy of their respect. In contrast, Climb passed another group of people in the hallway who viewed him with open hostility. They were the maids. Almost all of them frowned whenever they saw Climb. Unlike regular maids, the maidservants of the royal palace were all noble women who had come here to raise their own standing. Thus, to some extent, they were of higher status than Climb. In particular, the maids who personally served the royal family were heiresses of high-ranking nobility. They plainly displayed their anger at having to bow and scrape before a man who was beneath a mere peasant. It was true that Climb was lower born than they were, so it was not hard to see why they would give him the stink eye when Runner was not looking. Climb understood this, and he had never once gotten angry at them for that. However, that mindset, combined with Climb's own blank expression, made the maids think he was snubbing them, and it only deepened their anger for him. Meanwhile, Climb paid that vicious cycle no heed. Or rather, it might be better to say that if he was really that careful, he ought to be able to tie off those loose ends in a better way. Even so, Climb felt mentally fatigued after walking through this palace. There were other members of the royal family in the palace besides Renner and Rampasa III. GGH. As Climb saw one of those royals approach, he immediately went to the wall, his back ramrod straight, and pressed his hand to his chest in a salute. 2 people approached him. The one behind was a tall, skinny man, with a head of slicked-back blonde hair. His name was Marquis Raven, one of the kingdom's 6 great nobles. The problem was the slightly plump man walking in front of him. His name was Zinak Valranagana Ryle Viself. He was the king's 2nd son, and second in line for the throne. Zinak stopped, and his fatty jowled face contorted. "Oh, if it isn't Climb. Are you going to see Thart monster?" There was only one person whom Prince Zinak referred to a monster. Climb knew that what he was about to do might well give offense to a social superior, but he simply could not let it slide. "Your Highness, forgive my impertinence, but Lady Renner is no monster. A gentle, compassionate and beautiful person like herself is more like the kingdom's treasure." She had solved the slave problem and proposed policies which put the common man first. If she did not qualify as a treasure, then what did? Granted, the nobles frequently obstructed her legislation and prevented most of her policies from being implemented, but Clyme still knew how much she thought of the people. This gentlewoman wept before Clyme whenever her populist policies were denied. What right did a useless man, Zanak, have to lecture her? Anger flared up within Clyme's heart, and he longed to give Zanak a good punch. They might only be half related by blood, but they were still of the same bloodline, and he should not be saying such things. However, Clyme did not allow his anger to take physical form. Renner had once said, "My brother wants to provoke you into slandering him. I'm sure he's trying to find an excuse to take you away from me. Clyme, you must not show any weakness to my brother." Clyme thought back to the day when he had solemnly sworn that he would never betray that forlorn look on his master's face, she who had been abandoned even by her family. "I never said Renner was a monster. That's just what you're thinking. Forget it, enough with the cliched excuses. Still, to think you'd actually consider her a treasure. When she makes her proposals, does she actually think they'd be accepted? I can't help but think that she suggests them even when she knows they'll be rejected anyway." How could that be? It was impossible. This man was simply guessing wildly in his hideous jealousy. "Your servant submits that such is not the case here." Who? So you don't consider that woman a monster? I don't know if you have terrible taste or if her acting's too good. I'd suggest you doubt her a little more. How could I doubt her? Renner-sama is a treasure of the kingdom. Of that I have no doubt. Everything she did was righteous. Clyme could come to that conclusion because he had been watching from beside her. Really now, is that so? How interesting. Then, could you send that monster a message? Tell her that, while I, as her elder brother, consider you as a political tool, if you're willing to help me, I can relieve you of your inheritance and grant you a domain on the borderlands. Frustration surged up in Clyme's heart. Surely you jest. I can hardly believe you would actually tell me that in a place like this, so I shall pretend that I never heard it. Who? What a shame. Let's go, Marquis Raven. The silent man nodded from where he had been watching Clyme and Zanak from the side. Clyme did not quite understand Marquis Raven. He seemed to have drawn a clear line between himself and Clyme, but he did not look at Clyme the same way the other nobles did. Renner had not given Clyme any special instructions about Raven either. Ah, yes. Marquis Raven agrees with me that that woman is a monster. No, it is more that we have the same vision, hence our alliance. My prince. Let me say it, Marquis Raven. Heed my words, Clyme. If you were blindly devoted to her, I wouldn't be telling you all this. However, I feel that you've been deceived by that monster. That's why I'm telling you, in good faith, about her monstrous nature. My prince, forgive my rudeness, but could you tell me in what way is Renner-sama a monster? Nobody cares more for the country and the people than she does. That's because everything she does is a waste of effort. She moves too much for too little gain. At first, I thought she was simply inept at dealing with others. Then, while discussing the matter with Marquis Raven, I realized that she might already have accounted for that. Once I realized that, everything fell into place. If that was really the case, then she would be a woman who, while locked up the palace, could manipulate the nobles as she desired. What is that, if not a monster? Certainly you must be mistaken. Renner-sama is not that kind of person. Clyme insisted. Her tears were most definitely genuine. Renner was a compassionate woman. Clyme knew this better than anyone else, given that she had picked him up. However, Clyme's words could not move the prince. He smiled bitterly, and then left Clyme. Marquis Raven followed behind him. Clyme muttered to himself in the now deserted corridor. Renner-sama is the kindest person in our country. My existence is proof of that. If Clyme swallowed the following words, but spoke them in his heart. If Renner-sama were to rule the kingdom, it would surely become a great nation that puts the people first. Of course, that was an impossible dream given the reality of the succession. Even so, Climb could not abandon that idea. Lower fire month, 9th month, 3rd day, 8:11. Shortly after that, Climb arrived at his most frequently visited room in the palace. After checking several times to make sure nobody was around, he reached out and turned the doorknob. Entering without knocking was an exceedingly impolite course of action. However, the owner of this room had asked him to do so. His mistress had refused to listen to his protests, no matter what he said. In the end, Climb had given in. There was no way he could win when women's tears flowed. Still, his mistress had permitted him several exceptions to that. For instance, there was no way he could barge in unannounced if the king was present. That said, entering without knocking was very stressful on Climb. People who do that ought to be punished. It was only natural for him to feel stressed out when he thought about that as he opened the door. Just as Climb was about to push it open, he heard the sounds of a heated discussion through the half-opened door. There were two voices, both female. One of them belonged to his mistress. Climb was still standing outside the door, but she had not noticed him. That was probably because she was too excited about the discussion. That being the case, Climb did not wish to dampen her ardor. Climb stood still, listening to the discussion within the room. He felt guilty about eavesdropping, but he would feel worse if he interrupted their conversation. I told you, didn't I? People have always focused on immediate gains. The crop rotation plan you were talking about, Renner. I have no idea how that will increase yields. But how long will it take to show results? About 6 years or so. And how much money will be lost in planting other crops during these 6 years? That would depend on the crops in question. However, assuming a normal yield is 1, I think the yield would go down to 0. In other words, it's a 20% loss of revenue. However, after the 6th year, the yield will go up by 0.3 forever. I'm sure the figure will be higher if we add pastures for livestock into the mix. That does sound quite tempting, but can farmers really take a loss of 20% of their income for 6 whole years? I think we could have the country extend interest-free loans to compensate for the 20% loss and then ask for repayment after the yields return to normal. If the yields don't go up, then it won't have to be repaid, or there could be some other way. The important thing is that once the yields go up, the loans can be paid off in 4 years. That might be hard. Why is that? I told you, didn't I? People prefer to focus on immediate gains, and many people want stability. A lot of people will hesitate even if you tell them they'll be able to get 130% of their original crops in 6 years. Don't get it. It worked really well on the test field. Maybe the experiment went well, but you still can't guarantee that it'll succeed. Well, it's true that we didn't foresee every possible condition while conducting the experiment, so we can't be absolutely certain of the results. If we had to consider soil quality and the weather as well, the experiment would have become too big. That's troubling. I don't know if that 30% increase is a minimum figure or an average amount. Either way, it's not very convincing. You need to guarantee profits, and that they won't lose out in the short term. How about subsidizing the 20% shortfall for the 6-year period? The noble faction would love that because it would weaken the king's power. But if we can guarantee a big return after 6 years, the kingdom will grow stronger too, right? That also means that the opposing noble faction will become stronger as well, while the king's side will have 20% lower yields. The nobles of the royal faction won't stand for it. Then how about asking the merchants? Those big traders. They have their own politics among them. If they help the royals too readily, it might ruin their relationship with the nobles. There sure are a lot of problems. Look huge. And they all come up because you're not good at forward planning. Well, I do understand it's hard to get a proposal passed when there are 2 huge blocks within the country. What about just implementing it under crown territory? My brothers won't approve. Ah, you mean those gentlemen who left their wisdom in their mothers' bellies for your sake. But we don't have the same mother. Ah, then they left it in the king. Still, it's pretty bad when even the royal family isn't united. The room fell silent, which told Climb that the discussion was over. Ah, you can come in. Can't he, Renner? Climb's heart lurched as he heard those words. He was surprised that she had sensed his presence, but at the same time, he had been somewhat expecting that. He slowly opened the door. Pardon me. A familiar sight filled Climb's eyes. The room was luxurious but not tacky, and there were two blonde-haired maidens seated at a window-side table. Both of them were beautiful young ladies in complimentary dresses. One was the owner of this room, Renner. The other one sat opposite her. Her eyes were green and her lips were pink, and she was in radiant health. While her looks fell short of Renner, she exuded a charm of her own. If Renner sparkled like a gemstone, then she glowed with vitality. Her name was Lacuche Alvain de Alendra. It was hard to tell given the sheer pink dress she wore, but this woman was the leader of one of the two adamantite-ranked adventurer teams in the kingdom, and Lacuche's closest friend. She had racked up a considerable tally of accomplishments at the tender age of 19, and the fact that she had attained the coveted rank of adamantite must be due to her astounding talent. Climb felt the stirring of jealousy in the depths of his soul. Good morning, Renner-sama, Andra-sama. Good morning, Climb. Morning. After greeting them, Climb made to move to his designated location behind and to the right for Renner, but a voice halted him. Climb, not there. Here. Renner indicated the chair to her right. Climb found this very strange. There were 5 chairs arranged around the circular table. That much was normal. However, 3 cups of tea had been poured. One was in front of Renner, another was before Lacuche, and one more was in front of the seat beside Lacuche, not the one Renner had indicated. Climb looked around, but he could not find any trace of the third person. Climb was surprised, but he looked at the chair anyway. Renner's orders to Climb had caused a great deal of strain for him, be it in a commoner sharing a table with their master, a member of royalty, or in barging into a room uninvited. But Climb looked pleadingly to the other woman for help. He hoped against all hope that she would reject the request, but that hope was promptly denied him. I don't mind. This. Andra-sama. I told you before, didn't I? Call me Lacuche. Lacuche looked to Renner. Climb's special meanie. Lacuche appended what sounded like a heart to the end of her sentence in sickly sweet tones, to which Renner replied with a note of mock complaint and a smile. Of course, that was if a curl of the lips which was not matched by her eyes counted as a smile. Andra-sama, please don't tease me. Fine, fine, fine. You really are a stick in the mud, aren't you, Climb? You should learn not to get hung up on details like her. Teasing? Faced with Renner's look of surprise, Lacuche froze in an incredibly fake way before exhaling with exaggerated intensity. Of course. Well, Climb is special, but that's because he's yours. Renner's face flushed pink, and she clapped her hands to her cheeks. Climb had no idea what to do and looked away from Renner, and then his eyes went wide. That was because there was someone seated in the shadows in the corner of the room, hugging their knees to themselves. She was a woman who wore form-fitting black clothing that seemed utterly incongruous with the room's atmosphere. Wah! Shocked, Climb grabbed at the sword at his waist and lowered his stance, prepared to protect Renner. Lacuche sighed. Now you've gone and scared Climb by taking on that stance. There was no caution or awareness of danger in Lacuche's cool voice. Climb realized what that meant and let the strength drain from his shoulders. Understood, boss. The woman seated in the darkness sprang to her feet in an instant. Ah, you probably don't know her, Climb. She's a member of my team. It's Tina-san, Renner helpfully supplied. From what Climb knew, the Adamantite adventurer team, Blue Rose, was composed of 5 women. The leader and divine magic caster Lacuche, the warrior Garen, the arcane magic caster Evil Eye, and then the rogues Tia and Tina. Climb had seen the first 3 before, but not the latter 2. So she must be. I see. Her reputation's not for show. Given her long limbs and her tight-fitting clothes, she looked the part of someone versed in thief-type techniques. Forgive me. Pleased to meet you. My name is Climb. Climb bowed deeply to Tina. Don't worry about it. She waved casually to Climb, and then she silently stalked towards the table with the fluid grace of a savage beast. Then, she took a seat on the chair beside Lakush. It would seem the tea from just now was hers. Climb carefully surveyed his surroundings to check for another unseen female. There were only 3 cups of tea on the table, so it seemed unlikely, but he did so anyway. Lakush sensed the reason behind Climb's gawking and said, Tia's not here. Garen and Evil Eye both dislike stuffy occasions. But it's not that stuffy, is it? I'm wearing a proper dress just in case, but I didn't insist on them doing the same. Lakush might have said that, but the fact was that etiquette required one to wear formal dress in front of a princess. Of course, Climb had no intention of saying that to the face of Renner's friend, particularly a lady who was a member of the peerage. I see. Still, it is an honor to make the acquaintance of the famed Tina-sama. I hope I will have the chance to benefit from your guidance in the future. Talk after you sit down, Climb. Saying so, Renner poured a fresh cup of tea. The tea, which flowed from the magic item known as a warm bottle, was ping hot, as though it had just been brewed. The warm bottle could maintain the temperature and composition of its contents for an hour, and it was one of Renner's favored magic items. It saw frequent use when entertaining important guests, though not at other times. Climb knew that there was no protesting this and resigned himself. Thus, he sat down and drank his tea. It's delicious, Renner-sama. Renner smiled, but in all honesty, Climb could not tell if it was good or not. Still, since Renner had made it, he automatically deemed it good. Suddenly, a flat, emotionless voice spoke out. That girl should be gathering intelligence today. The 3 of us were supposed to come here together, but in the end, our Oni leader handed out work at the last minute. It's all our Oni leader's fault. Needless to say, that voice came from Tina. A frightening smile came over Laku's face as she heard the words. Oni. Climb tore his eyes away and said, I see. I hope I'll be able to see her sometime. Climb. Tina-san and Tia-san are twins. Even their hairstyles are almost identical. So once you've seen one, you've seen the other. Climb did not think the matter was that simple, but he nodded in understanding. Still, Tina stared unabashedly at Climb, making him feel uncomfortable. His original plan was just to bear with it, but then he realized that she might have noticed something about him, and so he made up his mind to ask her. Is something the matter? You're too big, huh? He heard, but he did not understand. After seeing the question marks popping up over Climb's head, Lakush cut in and apologized. It's nothing. Just an in-joke. Don't take it to heart, okay, Climb? No, don't worry about it. Really? Yes. What's the matter, Lakush? Climb told himself not to be a busybody, but Renner could not seem to accept that and interjected. Lakush had a sour look on her face as she looked at Renner. Really, whenever we start talking about Climb. Quiet. I didn't bring Tia along because she'd fill Renner's head with nonsense. So could you please understand that and not blabber on so much? Yes, Oni boss. Lakush. What's all this about? Laku's face began to twitch once Renner began asking, and her expression turned depressed. She shifted her line of sight to Climb just as he was about to butt in. Climb, it looks like you really favor this suit of armor. Yes. This armor is exquisite. Thank you very much. This was about as awkward of a topic change as there could be, but Climb did not want to embarrass a guest. After going with it, he idly stroked the suit of snow-white full-plate armor which his mistress had gifted him. It had been made with large quantities of mithril and some orichalcum and further enchanted, making it surprisingly light and tough. Blue Rose had supplied the mithril for its construction at no charge. Climb could not thank them enough for that, however low he bowed. Just as he was about to do so, Lakush halted him. Don't worry about it. We simply gave you the leftover materials from making our mithril armor. While she called them leftovers, the fact was that mithril was an extremely expensive material. Perhaps mithril-ranked adventurers might own a mithril weapon, while orichalcum-ranked adventurers might be able to afford the construction of a suit of mithril full plate. But only adamantite-ranked adventurers could give the suit to others at no charge. Besides, Runner asked me, how could I refuse? You refused to take my money. I had some pocket money saved up. It's not right for a princess to spend her allowance, don't you think? That's separate from my domain's income. I just wanted to use my own money to make Climb's armor. I figured you wanted to use your own money to make a shiny new set of full plate for Climb. If you knew, then why did you give it to me for free? Lakush, you dummy. Given the circumstances, should you really be calling me a dummy? Thus did the fuming Renner and the giggling Lakush go back and forth, in an argument that hardly qualified as an argument. As he saw this, Climb's face stiffened into an emotionless mask. The fact that he could witness a heartwarming scene like this was all thanks to being rescued by his mistress. However, he could not allow himself to express his feelings. Showing his gratitude was one thing, but behind that gratitude was a powerful emotion that could never be displayed. That was his love for her. Climb forcibly crushed that feeling and hid it away within himself. In its place, he repeated the lines he had repeated several times now. Thank you very much, Runner-sama. As she heard the way in which he clearly demarcated the separation between the two of them, it was a hint that master and servant were in different circumstances. Runner smiled. Only Climb, who had observed her longer than anyone else, who had been watching her every day, could tell that her smile was tinged with loneliness. It's fine. Now, I think we've drifted quite a ways off topic. Let's get back to the previous discussion. 8 fingers, you say? We were talking about how we attacked 3 of their drug-producing villages and burned their fields to ash. I doubt they can recover from that. As he heard that name, Climb mentally frowned under his iron mask. 8 Fingers was the name of the criminal syndicate writhing about in the darkness of the kingdom. His beloved mistress had taken action to suppress them. It was not hard to imagine the miserable fate of a village which relied on drugs to survive when their fields had been burned down. However, they were a necessary sacrifice to eliminate the drugs plaguing the kingdom. Perhaps if Renner possessed supreme power, she might be able to do something else. However, Renner had no backers despite being a princess. All she could do was perform the cold calculus of saving those who could be saved and abandoning everyone else. On the other hand, Renner might have been able to beg a boon of her father to attack them with authority or military force. However, 8 Fingers were deeply entwined with the nobles, and if word got out, they might well burn the evidence of their wrongdoing. Therefore, Renner had decided to directly employ her friend Lakush. Climb knew this was a very risky path to take. Under normal circumstances, adventurers worked through the guild, and they were not allowed to take requests directly from clients. That was a violation of the guild's rules. Granted, he did recall that the guild could not punish its highest-ranked, adamantite-ranked adventurers, nor could it expel them. Even so, it would still tarnish their reputation within the guild and would surely lead to repercussions in the future. However, Blue Rose had accepted the task anyway because they loved their country that much, and because Renner was their friend. Climb's gratitude towards Lakush grew as she realized that she was willing to make sacrifices for the greater good. Lakush decided that they should no longer talk about this anymore. She opened up the bag Tina presented to her, and took out a scroll. This was a document, which nobody in Blue Rose could decipher. However, Lakush felt that the smartest person she knew, Renner, might be able to make some head or tail of it. We found this scroll while burning the drug villages. It looked like some kind of written order, so we brought it back. Can you understand it? They opened the scroll, and saw an expanse of symbols. They did not look like letters from any country's language. Renner glanced at them, and casually replied, "It's a substitution cipher." No. Substitution ciphers were a form of code made by substituting a letter or several letters for another letter or symbol. For instance, A might become and B might become. Thus the symbols would mean Abba. I thought so too. I tried swapping symbols around for hours, but I couldn't make any sense of it. We took a man prisoner who looked like he was in charge because we suspected that he might have memorized the cipher key. And we were planning to use charm magic on him to make him decode the message for us. However, you should know that when the same caster uses the same spell on the same subject multiple times, you get poorer results. Therefore, I wanted to make good use of our first casting. So I decided to discuss it with you before using the spell. I see. And the reason this was left there was because a trap, or something more? If that's the case, they wouldn't use a code that was too hard to break. I don't think this will be very difficult. Renner's words left LeQ's eyes wide. She could not help but exchange glances with Tina, who was seated beside her. Unbelievable. But at the same time, they thought, I knew she could do it. Let me think. In the kingdom's language, the first word of any document is either a masculine, feminine, or neuter pronoun. Give me a moment. As she muttered to herself, Renner rose with the scroll and went to fetch paper and pen. Then, she began writing out blocks of text on the paper. This is a simple substitution cipher of one character for one symbol, so breaking it is easy. And fortunately, they were using the kingdom's language. If they had used the empire's literature or something like that as a cipher, it'd be almost unbreakable. But this, well, once you know what one of the words means, you can just fill them in one by one. Anyone could break this if they were willing to work hard. No. Well, you make it sound easy. But wouldn't that mean you'd need to know tens of thousands of words to break the code? Well, these are encoded literary references. Those usually won't be too flowery, and they can't use words that are too complex either. So they'd have to make it simple enough that even a child could understand it. That narrows things down a lot. Inside her heart, LeQ broke out in a cold sweat. Her friend made it sound so simple, but it was hardly as simple as she said. Still, she really ought to be able to do it. I can hardly believe such a genius really exists. Renner had brushed it off every time they met or talked, but LeQ had never met anyone else like Renner who deserved to be called a genius. As LeQ trembled internally, Renner lightly said, saying, "It's done." Just a bunch of book references before handing the paper to her. There were many locations within the kingdom written upon it, and 7 of them were within the royal capital. Are these drugs storehouses or other important bases? I doubt they'd put such an important document in an ordinary production area. This is probably bait, don't you think? Bait? As in for a trap? I don't think so. Think of it this way. 8 Fingers is one organization, but they're more like 8 separate groups working together, right? LeQ nodded. So this should be information about the other 7 groups. Or should I say divisions? In any case, this is a way to deliberately leak information on everyone besides the drugs division to outside enemies, in order to briefly take the heat off themselves. In other words, they already gathered information on the other divisions for this. I didn't expect them to be totally united, but this is just ridiculous. As an adventurer, the notion of betraying one's comrades frustrated her. While we were already going to do that, we'd better not act too hastily, or else it might turn out badly for us. After seeing her friend, Renner, nod, LeQ asked again. So what should we do about that brothel? I've heard it's a really vile place where one can experience anything they desire. LeQ felt her anger build just by mentioning it. Bastards. Those scum who can only think with their dicks ought to be killed. When she recalled what she had learned about the brothel in question, she was no longer a noble heiress but a bold adventuress, and the curses welled up from inside her heart. The meaning of the phrase, anything they desire, went without saying. It was certain that no few people, men and women both, had been murdered for entertainment. In the past, when slavery had not yet been criminalized, there were quite a few such bordellos operating in the underworld. However, thanks to the friend before her, the slave trade was now illegal, and those establishments had faded like dust on the wind. This particular location might well be the last illegal brothel in the kingdom. For that reason, they would not shut down easily. One could imagine what sort of determined resistance awaited them. After all, it was a tainted paradise for those people with crude, unspeakable desires. Say, Renner, since we can't deal with them through the law, why not have us force our way in and expose their crimes? It'll be okay as long as we find evidence, right? If the slave trading division really is running that brothel, then breaking them will be a huge blow. Plus, depending on where the evidence points, we'll be able to teach a painful lesson to the nobles who are in league with them. You might be right, Lacuche. But if you do that, won't it inconvenience your family? The Alvain family? I find it very hard to act because of that. The same thing goes for the other members of Blue Rose. But having Klein barge in there alone seems almost impossible. Your servant deeply regrets his lack of strength. As she saw Klein bow in apology, Renner reached out a hand to take Klein's own, and smiled. Forgive me, Klein. That wasn't what I meant. It's the only underworld brothel in the royal capital, so nobody could take it down by themselves. See, I trust you most of all, Klein. I know how hard you work for me. However, don't do anything which might get yourself involved. This isn't a request, but an order, okay? If anything happened to you. Even Lacuche, as a woman watching from the side, was moved by the tears of the ravishing beauty before her eyes. Then how about Klein? He tried his best to put on an emotionless front, but he could not. Those flushed cheeks said everything for him. Were a bard to give a title to this moving scene, said Bard would surely name it The Princess and Her Knight. Yet, Lacuche felt a twinge of fear. She thought that it ought to be impossible, but if Renner were doing this on purpose, then she would be a vixen of truly unimaginable proportions. What am I thinking? Why am I doubting my good friend? Besides, hasn't everything that's happened up till now proven that she's not a petty little schemer? If I can't even trust someone like her, someone with the title of Golden, who crusades for justice, then who can I trust? Lacuche shook her head, and spoke. That was also to dispel the frightening notion in her head. Ah, yes. Tina's investigations have uncovered several leaders in the slave trade, several nobles with links to Coco Doll. However, we haven't verified their guilt yet, so it's too early to take action right now. Renner and Klein reacted to one particular name among the list. Lacuche recited. That man's daughter is one of my personal maids. Well, I don't think she was sent there as a spy because they're on guard against you. But still, I can't be sure that she's just a maid looking to promote herself. Indeed. Looks like we've policed the information quite well. Klein, you also have to keep that in mind. Then, let's discuss what to do about the locations we've learned from the coded orders. Renner, would you mind lending me Klein? I'd like him to tell Garen and the others that they may need to move out for an emergency.